Hello everyone, this is Jason Tondro, your professor for World Lit, and we are back for another lecture. This time we're going to deal with Ariosto and Cervantes, two writers of the Renaissance. Ariosto, the dominant voice of Italy, Italian romantic poetry, epic poetry, and Cervantes, the incredibly influential and significant voice of Spain. His writing in prose fiction. But when we ask what do these two people have in common, other than the fact that they lived in relatively contemporaneous times, is that they are both dealing with the romance, although they're approaching it from a very different direction. Think back to some of the other things that we've read in this class already. We've already talked about what the romance is, and what is the definition of the romance. And if you put a bunch of lit scholars in the same room, they'll debate this topic endlessly. But there are some characteristics that we can say that the romances have in common, and one of these is a very imaginative aspect to the work. It doesn't attempt to be realistic. People will look at it and say, well, it doesn't seem very realistic. And the answer is, well, it's not supposed to be. That's not the point. It is, in fact, more of a fantasy. Okay, what else? Well, the protagonists are generally privileged. That is, whatever society that author is writing in, or whatever culture the protagonists are from, they are from the upper crust of that society, which usually means that they're rich white men, often aristocrats, knights, kings, or the sons of kings. And if you look back at the other things we've been reading, you will be surprised how many of the things we've read qualify under these characteristics. I mean, the obvious stuff are what we think of traditional romances, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or Landval, right? These are romances in the sense that they were even called romances when they were written. And what that meant to the people at the time was they were about knights on adventure. But cast your reading further back, and you're going to go and you're going to find things like even Virgil's story of Aeneas, who is white, privileged, and male, and who engages with gods and fantastic things all the time. We didn't read the section where he descends to the underworld and talks to the ghost of his dead father, right? But that's the sort of stuff that happens in Virgil. And, of course, Virgil is writing from Homer, he's trying to out-Homer. And the Iliad and Homer's other book, the Odyssey, are filled with these fantastic, imaginative events around a protagonist who is privileged. And also, all of these works become very allegorical in nature. And I think this is another very important aspect to a lot of these romances, is that the people and the places, the objects, the clothing, the horses, the weapons are all symbolic. They all come to represent something other than simply horses, weapons, and mountains, right? All right, so what do these two people that we're reading then have in common? Well, if you think of all this literature that we've been reading, not all of it, but a lot of it, as part of that Romance tradition, well, Ariosto's read all that stuff. And his romantic epic, Orlando, Furioso, or Roland the Mad, Roland Gone Crazy, if you will, is a kind of attempt to outdo all the previous people that had come before him. Just like Virgil was trying to outdo Homer. And Malory, when he wrote the Arthurian romances, which we didn't read, he was trying to outdo the French guys who came before him. And Chaucer is trying to outdo the French guys, and so on and so on, until we get to Ariosto, who's trying to outdo all of those guys. And so he takes all the fantasy and the action and the the tropes of these earlier romances, and he just cranks them up to 11 and makes it as outlandish and at the same time as action oriented and as poetic as he can. He just tries to make it the superlative of its form. And in the process, he basically goes completely overboard with it. And you look at it, you're going to read a section of it, maybe 10 or 12 pages, not that much of it, and it's going to seem to you just completely over the top. Well, that's exactly how the people who read it thought. They thought, yeah, it is. It's completely over the top. But that's the point. It's supposed to be over the top. Meanwhile, Cervantes' reaction to the romance is completely different. If you've got this genre, and it's basically reached the end of its, its growth cycle. It's gotten as good as it can get. We've sort of played out all the tropes. We've written a bunch of them, and everything is sort of kind of gone to its logical extreme. Well, there's basically two ways you can go. You can take it to its illogical extreme, which is what Ariosto does in Orlando, Furioso, right? He takes these stories and he just goes crazy with them. Or you can start to make fun of it. You can parody and satirize it. And that's what Cervantes does in Don Quixote, in which he takes all the tropes and he inverts them so that our protagonist is, yes, he insists that he's a knight and he's honorable and out for adventure and he has a romantic lady love and he fights giants and he has all these, and he's got an adversary who's an evil wizard, and except that he's crazy and none of these things actually exist. When he goes to fight giants, they're actually windmills. When he sees an army, two armies fighting, they're really just sheep. And his massive resplendent armor that protects him and that allows him to fight all the enemies is really old and rusted, and his sword is broken and he carries around an old stick. It becomes satire. If you allow yourself, you will even find parts of Don Quixote funny. Now, I realize that reading something 400 years old, it's hard to find it funny, but there are parts of it that are funny even to us today, and when we get to it, we'll work through those. So we're going to start off with Ariosto. It's not especially long. There's just a couple of segments of it that I want to talk about, and I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to who Ariosto was and how where he was coming from as a creator. And then we'll get to Cervantes, and him we have to spend more time with. You've got a much larger section in your book on it. There's a number of very important episodes, and Don Quixote is a challenge to read. It's not easy. So we'll talk about maybe how to make it a little bit easier for you as we go. Okay, so let's start with Ariosto. And we've already talked about this idea that Ariosto sees himself as part of a legacy of romances that goes back to Homer and Virgil and goes all the way up through people like Mallory or Chrétien, who wrote before Mallory, as a French author of romances who wrote The Knight of the Cart, and stories like Lanval, Sir Gawain the Green Knight, Chaucer's satire or parody of romances in The Wife of Bath's Tale. And at the very outset of Ariosto's book, he's going to be very clear about this. He's like, you've read all these romances, and now, we saved the best for last. I'm gonna outdo all those guys. And he's very clear about his desire to do this. And this might be a good point for us to bring up this idea of this compulsion writers have to outdo whoever came before them. The scholar who has articulated this in the most influential form is Harold Bloom, who's a Shakespeare scholar, American lit scholar, very highly distinguished, and he's got 24 books out. But one of them, and one of his most influential books, is called The Anxiety of Influence. And in this book, Bloom argues that this is this is the single most convenient way to read literature, that almost everything shows this anxiety of influence. That is, a writer or a creator of some kind looks back to the people that have come before him and feels this enormous pressure to compete, to be as good as or better than the people that have come before. You look at all these past people that have written and you say, how can I compete with Homer? How can I compete with Virgil? And you either say I can't and you stop writing, or you say I can and you try to one up them. And often this one upmanship involves taking whatever they did and kind of intentionally destroying it in a kind of Oedipal complex gone amok. If you remember the Oedipal complex, this idea that sons hate their fathers and want to kill them. And Bloom uses the Oedipal complex in his argument about the anxiety of influence, that in a sense every creator is like Oedipus looking at his father and thinking the only way I'm going to get ahead is if I can murder you. And you can apply this to film and music and all kinds of things, and the way that creators feel pushed by the immense respect and regard they have for the people that came before them. Or maybe not, maybe we shouldn't call it respect and regard. Maybe that's too positive. Or that's why Bloom just calls it this anxiety, this kind of competitive pressure in the people that come before. Well, we certainly see that happening in Ariosto, and he's very upfront about it and his desire to one-up. And if it's any consolation, after Ariosto publishes his book, other people try to one-up him. So then you get Edmund Spenser, the great romantic poet of the Elizabethan era of Shakespeare's day, who writes The Faerie Queene, which is written for Queen Elizabeth and is a specific attempt to out Orlando. Right? All right. Let's look for some. Start talking about some possible themes and important plot elements, or something that's going to come back and that you'll start to recognize in these. A lot of these romances, that they speculate, they take a protagonist, and he's usually chasing a woman. In this case, there's the most beautiful woman in the world. She's this princess. Her name is Angelica, and all these characters are chasing Angelica all over Europe. Orlando Furioso is a very cosmopolitan work. It involves Christian knights and Muslim knights. It takes place over Italy, Spain, England, France. It goes the Holy Land. It goes all over. It's very worldly, and it reflects Ariosto's position in Italy, where you were at the center of that kind of commercial, pilgrim, mercantile network. If knights wanted to go on crusade, they had to go through Italy. If ordinary people wanted to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, like the wife of Bath, they had to go through Italy. If you were a merchant who was making money in the Mediterranean Sea, you went through Italy. And if you lived in Italy, you saw all these people. It's much different than, the writers in England, for example, who, they might, their exposure to these other cultures was much different. All right, so you have these central characters. In this case, you have the character of Orlando, and Orlando is based on the character of Roland. Roland, one of the knights of Charlemagne, whose poem, The Song of Roland, is one of those romantic epics that Ariosto is trying to integrate and surpass. The specific history of Roland, the character, or the Song of Roland isn't especially important to us here. It's enough to say that, to remember our history, that in the 6th century, the Muslim faith and the Islamic empires began spreading very rapidly through military conquest, all through the northern coast of Africa, through Egypt, for example, and the rest of North Africa, until they got to the northern coast of Africa across from Spain, the Straits of Gibraltar. And they crossed over and invaded Spain, and they conquered all of Spain and began pushing into France. And they were stopped in France by Charles Martel, Charlemagne's father, Charles the Hammer. Well, the Song of Roland is about the Reconquista, which is the reconquest of Spain by the Christians from the Moors, which is the word that they use for Muslims. And it's still used as late as Shakespeare's day when we refer to characters like Othello the Moor, which just meant he was Islamic, he was African. The Song of Roland is about Charlemagne's withdrawal from Spain back to France, and his rear guard as they go through these mountains called the Pyrenees, which you can look up on a map or Wikipedia. The Pyrenees are a mountain range that separates Spain from France, and as he's retreating through these mountains, he has Roland, his greatest warrior, guarding the rear with about 10,000 men, I think, and they are betrayed by another Christian knight whose name is Ganelon, and Ganelon out of political competition, out of a political rivalry with Roland, betrays Roland to the Moors, who then ambush Roland and his army with about 300,000 Muslims. And the result is a massacre, and Roland dies there in the mountains. We're not reading the Song of Roland. It's a very, very interesting poem, but we didn't have time to get to it this semester. But the character of Orlando is supposed to be that guy, that Roland. Okay, so he's one of the great knights of Charlemagne. These knights were known as paladins, the paladins of Charlemagne, and they're essentially a second version of the Round Table. Just like Arthur had his group of knights, who were the greatest of all knights, and you had Lancelot and Gawain and Galahad and Percival and Tristan and all those guys. So Charlemagne intentionally, not by accident, but intentionally created a new group of knights based on the Round Table called the Paladins, or the 12 Peers. And Roland was one of these paladins. So the basic plot of Ariosto involves all of these paladins, these knights in service to Charlemagne, running all over Europe, many of them chasing a woman. And there's also Muslim knights there, who, by the way, it's important to note, are not portrayed as evil or wicked or stupid, as they are almost uniformly presented in the Song of Roland. Ariosto is much more humanistic in his approach. You know, that a Muslim knight can be a good, honorable, and virtuous guy just as much as a Christian knight can. But the book itself is called Orlando Furioso, Orlando Gone Crazy, or Orlando the Mad. Now, if you made a film version of this, there's two ways you could play it. You could do it straight, as the Lord of the Rings kind of adventure tale, or you could do it for comedy, because a lot of it is just so exaggerated, it's so over the top that it becomes a kind of high camp. Imagine, if you will, Orlando Furioso played by Will Ferrell, and we're getting somewhere. Why is he crazy? Okay, this is a recurrent theme in these romances, that the protagonist is driven mad by love, or that he has a kind of habit of going berserk or going crazy. And the ability to control his own rage is part of the genre. And of course, this should immediately be ringing bells for all of you guys, right? Because the rage of Achilles, I mean, this is an old question, and it's a metaphor, right? Because All right, let's rewind a little bit. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Okay. In Plato's, one of Plato's books, he creates this metaphor that reason and passion are like two horses. And a man is like the chariot driver who has to keep these two horses that are very different, one's black and one's white, running in the same direction. And this idea that our passion and our reason have to be controlled, and the sign of a mature adult, of an honorable and admirable man, is that he can control these two things at the same time and keep them all running kind of in the same direction. This gets adopted by the Romance authors, and they embody this in the knight and his horse, his steed. It all becomes a metaphor about our ability to control our own power. Okay, so you're powerful, and maybe that's a physical power. Maybe you're just big and strong. But maybe it's another kind of power. Maybe it's financial power. You're fabulously rich. Maybe you're a millionaire. You've got your own business. You're a CEO. Maybe it's social power. You have 500,000 friends on Facebook. You know, whatever your power might be. Okay. But can you use that power? How are you at controlling that power? Can you make that power do what you need it to do when you need it to do it? This is a very different question. And these romances often become meditations on this question. And they represent this question physically in allegory, because that's part of what a romance is. So when a knight is trying to control his horse, and his horse throws him off and goes riding off into the woods, this becomes a statement that the knight has done something wrong, because he has failed to, and that becomes obvious by the fact that he can now no longer control his power. He has lost control. In a literal sense, he's lost control of his horse. But in a thematic or a psychological sense, he's lost control of something else. His lust, his greed, his need for revenge, or his desire to compete, his need to be proven superior to others. He's lost control. And the authors make that clear physically when he loses control of people and objects and stuff. Okay? This making sense? All right. Those of you that have seen, if any of you have seen Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail, in which Arthur and Lancelot and Percival and Bedivere and all these guys appear, there's a section of that film that always makes people laugh. Lancelot comes across this castle, which is inhabited by nothing but beautiful young women, all of whom are virgins. And while he's in the castle, he goes berserk and starts killing everyone in the castle. Until finally, after he's killed almost everyone, and he just goes from room to room, just hacking up people, and the blood's going everywhere, he suddenly snaps out of it and starts apologizing. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. People laugh, but the fact is that that's the part of the movie that's actually closest to the book. It's actually a very accurate representation of Lancelot in the myths. These characters go berserk. And this berserkness, this quality in which they lose control and they just kill everything around them in this kind of berserker rage, is one of the most long-lasting and enduring characteristics of the protagonist of a romance. And he feels bad about it when he snaps out of it, and doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the protagonist has done something morally wrong, and he's losing it. So when you read your section of Ariosto, he's going to do this. He's going to go berserk because Orlando has been in love with Angelica, who doesn't even know he exists. He's completely devoted to her, and in his obsession over her, he has convinced himself that she also must love him. Because isn't that the way it works? I mean, I'm a good-looking, handsome knight. I've got everything. I mean, why wouldn't she love me? So she must love me. And these leaps of illogic are characteristic of characters like Orlando. And he, in our story, he'll come across evidence that she has, in fact, fallen in love with someone else. Not just someone else, a knight of Islam, a Moor. And Orlando tries to fool himself into thinking that, oh, no, maybe that name that she calls this guy, that she has for the knight, Medor, Medor is the name of the knight. Maybe that's like her pet name for me. When I find the forest grove where they've carved Angelica loves Medor and like every tree in the grove, maybe she means me. Oh, is that sweet? She calls me Medor. It's completely ridiculous, right? Well, finally, Orlando is confronted with hard evidence that no, she doesn't mean you. She means Medor, and he goes berserk. He becomes inhuman. That's interesting, isn't it? That we, in our foolishness, we become less human. By objectifying women into nothing more than objects, we become less human ourselves. Not like objects, but like animals. Contrast this with the more humanistic approach where we acknowledge that Angelica is a person, and she's going to have her own desires and her own wants and her own needs. She's going to be like the wife of Bath, right? She's going to want sovereignty. She's going to want authority over her own life. It's not for you, Orlando, to decide who Angelica gets to love. That's not your call. And when you strip Angelica of the power to decide her own self, you're making her less of a human being and into more of a commodity, an object that's to be bought and sold or traded. And when you make her into less of a human, you in turn become less human, but in a different way, because women are objectified, but men are savage. Ariosto, one of Ariosto's most admirable additions to the literary canon is the character of Bradamante, who is later serves as the inspiration for the character of Britomart in Spenser's Faerie Queene. Bradamante is a female knight. She is a woman who is a knight. And she is every bit as skilled and competent, in fact, in some ways, more virtuous, more admirable than the men that she competes with. And I think she's made better when she's revised as Britomart in Spenser's version. She becomes more of the protagonist, and the book is made better precisely to the degree by which she becomes the protagonist. But she's one of many characters in Ariosto's book, and Bradamante is a wonderful symbol and figure of female strength, nobility, and character. And Ariosto is very sensitive to these gender issues, and you can tell that he's sensitive to them because he writes about them. The second section from Ariosto in your book is from Canto 25. And in it, we get this very, very provocative story in which gender issues come to the front, and we start to see lots of gender slippage going on where gender roles get reversed. And this becomes a really important part of the romance, where, for example, in The Fairy Queen, you have a character who's a knight who loses a duel, and in punishment for the duel, he's forced to wear a dress and cook and sew for a living. He's made into a woman. And of course, he's defeated by a woman. He fights this Amazon, and she beats him. So he's feminized in the process, right? And he has to sew and cook and clean and wear a dress and drag. While all the women dress like men and do all the fighting. In this section, in Canto 25, we learn that there's this beautiful huntress. She's also a wealthy aristocrat. She's a noble woman. And her name is Fiordespina. Fiordespina. And Fiordespina falls in love with what she presumes is a knight. Because the knight's in armor, right? And armor's pretty bulky. It kind of covers up your figure. I mean, you can tell if someone's tall. You can tell how long their arms and legs are. But, it's pretty obscuring other than that. You kind of just get whatever shape the armor is shaped in. That's pretty much the person's figure. Well, anyway. So this knight that she falls in love with doesn't have his helmet on. And, he's just so pretty. he's just a knockout. And he's got short blonde hair and he's just so pretty, and she falls in love with him. She thinks he's pretty sexy first, and then she sort of lures him off away from they're all out hunting together. And she lures him off from all the others into a hidden grove, with like a pool of water and beautiful trees, and the music is playing, and the hummingbirds are singing chorus and everything. And she proceeds to confess her deep attraction to this knight, who then says, I'm a girl. Right? I'm a woman named Bradamant, and I had to cut my hair. I took a wound to the head, and because I took this wound to the head, they had to do some surgery on me, and so I had to cut my hair short. I used to have long hair in a braid, and I would wear it up on top of my head, and that's how everybody knew that I was female, because you can't tell when I'm in this armor. But yeah, so that's not really going to work, And there's this moment where Fiordespina is confronted with the fact that she has fallen in love with the woman, and she decides to love Bradamant anyway. It's a great scene. This is 1600 we're writing this book. Look, you're older than that, I'm sorry. 1500s. And she decides, well, I can't help but love you. I still love you. Only now my love is hopeless, because no female animal in the world loves another female animal. It's now become this impossible love. And Bradamant is very distressed by this, because she feels like she's embarrassed for Fiordespina's, and she doesn't really know how to respond to it, because she doesn't love Fiordespina back. And she doesn't really know how to respond, so she sort of hangs out with her for the night. They sleep in a bed, but nothing happens. Bradamant just sleeps, and Fiordespina sort of does the heavy sighing all night long, because she can't act on her passion. And then the next morning, Bradamant puts her armor on and says, yeah, I better go. And so she leaves, and that would be the end of the story, except that Bradamante has a twin brother. Now, for those of you that have read Shakespeare, Shakespeare read all this. Shakespeare read Ariosto, and half a dozen of Shakespeare's plays involve identical twins who gender swap. And I'm thinking, for example, the best one is probably Twelfth Night, in which, tell me if this sounds familiar, okay? You've got a young woman who disguises herself as a man, and then while she's in this foreign country, disguised as a man, a wealthy countess falls in love with her, thinking she's a man. Then confesses her love to this man, quote-unquote man, who runs for it, and this romance is unresolved until the girl, who's disguised as a man, in this case her name is Viola, until Viola's identical twin brother shows up, who looks just like her, except that he's a guy. And so, which means that because Viola was disguised as a guy, which means that she was disguised as her own brother, and her disguise is exactly what her brother looks like. So when Cesario is the name of Viola's brother in Twelfth Night, when Cesario shows up, the Countess thinks it's Viola. But you're the person I love. And Cesario was like, who are you? I don't know anything about any of this. And that's exactly what happens in this story. Bradamante's got a twin brother. And when she tells this whole story about Fior Spina and everything, apparently her brother decides his name is Ricardet or Richardet. His name literally means Little Richard, like the singer, like Ricardo, right? Anyway, so Little Richard apparently decides, I'm going to get me some of that, and he plays this elaborate practical joke on Fior Spina, which would be awful if it weren't for the fact that he falls in love with her about halfway through. He goes back to Fior Spina. His hair's cut short. He goes back to Fior Spina, and she's delighted to see him because she thinks he's Bradamante. And she embraces him and kisses him, thinking he's her, thinking that he is a woman. Embraces him, kisses him, takes all of his armor off, gets a dress for him to wear, which he puts on. And he's apparently like playing a woman. He's very careful about noting that he talks like his sister and he acts like his sister so that no one can tell that he's not Bradamante. And then after he, Little Richard, has been playing a woman for the whole day, he's alone with her, and he says, I bet you didn't think I was going to come back, did you? Remember, he's playing Bradamante now. He says, but let me tell you what happened. I had this amazing adventure. I rescued this nymph, this supernatural fairy of the forest, and I rescued her from men who were trying to ravage her. And she gave me a wish. She said, in return for rescuing me, I'll give you anything you want. And he said, and this is Richard speaking as Bradamante now, and he says, so I asked her a way to make you happy. I could tell that you were unhappy because I was a woman, so I asked the nymph to give me something to make Fior Spina happy. And, this should be ringing bells now, you do it however you want to do it. In other words, Richard says that he didn't ask the nymph for a specific thing. He didn't say, make me a woman. He didn't say any one of a dozen other ways we might think that Bradamante might satisfy. He didn't say any of that. He yielded sovereignty, right? In the immortal words of the wife of Bath. He told the nymph, you decide how to solve my problem. And the nymph changed him into a guy. And so little Richard now tells Fioruspina, and so now look, and he drops his pants, you know, I'm a man. And the language of the book gets pretty sexy here because Fioruspina like sort of, you know, takes him in her hand and she can't believe it that he's a man, and he's like, yeah, isn't this great? And he's pretending to be his sister transformed into a man. And it would be awful. He would be taking terrible advantage of her. Except that it's only defended by the fact that he says that he's fallen in love with her. And so this is a way for her to be happy and him to be happy and everybody wins, right? Well, it's intentionally ambiguous. I don't think anyone here that reads this book should think that Richard is off the hook, or, you know, it's a very complicated sequence of plot and action. And, you know, you look at this book and it was written in, you know, the early 1500s. And what is going on with these questions of gender politics, you know, that, and it's made perhaps even all the more fascinating by the idea that this amazing magical story that Richard tells about finding the nymph and rescuing her and everything, it's not at all out of place. It could have actually happened in the province of the book, in the context of the fantastical events that are in the book. It's completely plausible. Which makes us wonder, why can't it be real? What if Richard isn't Richard at all? What if there's just Bradamant? Or when Richard tells his story, he plagiarizes the Greek myths to do it. And one of the characters that he plagiarizes is these characters from Greek myth who were one person who changes back and forth in gender. What if there is only one? What if this whole business about the identical twins is a lie? And there's just one person that transgenders at need. I'm not saying that that's what Ariosto intended. I'm only throwing it out there to highlight the complex way that genders are portrayed and that people enact their gender. We haven't spent a lot of time on questions of gender performance and gender role, but there's been a long discussion in academic circles for decades now that gender is essentially, it doesn't hinge on biology. It's really performed. That is, in order to be perceived by the world as male, you do what men do, and you perform it. This is questions that's called performativity, and gender performativity. And conversely, to be perceived as feminine, you do what women do. And this is both intentional and unintentional and positive and negative. So when a guy talks about how he's got hobbies that are girlish hobbies, he gets perceived as feminine because of those hobbies, and vice versa. And a woman who rides a horse, or who, you know, shoots a gun, or joins the Marines, or whatever, is perceived as a man and is treated like a man because she's acting as a man does. She's performing a male gender. You see a lot of that in this lit. Okay. Let's pause there. We've done a little bit on Ariosto. We've given you plenty to chew on. Read through it, look it over, highlight it, make lots of marks in your book. We're going to come back in a minute and we'll start on Cervantes, okay? All right, everyone, we're back. And we're going to start on Cervantes here. He may take us a couple of sections to do, so be prepared for us to sort of split this up. Part of the reason why that's true is because Don Quixote can be a challenge to read. It's very episodic. The technical literary term is picaresque, which means that your characters sort of travel all over the world, having all these little adventures, and every little adventure seems unconnected to every little adventure that comes before or comes after. And when you read a picaresque novel, it can sort of wear on you, and you sort of wondering, well, what's the point? I mean, we go around and we have all these little adventures, but so what, right? What does it mean? And we don't see a lot of character growth or change from one point to the next. It's kind of like watching, a television series where, like a sitcom or something, where, from one episode to the next, nothing really changes. You have some emergency of the moment, some crisis of the moment. Oh, it's Joey's birthday or whatever. But then, a half an hour later, we all sort of reset the clock and we're back where we were when we started. And this can make the book difficult to get through. You don't have the whole book, but you do have a fairly large chunk of it. Now, we're only reading the first part of Don Quixote. We're not reading from part 2. Let's talk a little bit about Cervantes himself as a person. The most highly regarded writer in the Spanish language ever. The Spanish Shakespeare, I guess you could call him, right? Revered by Spanish speakers with that same level of absolute supremacy. Why? Cervantes writes in language that's easy to understand, about people who are very relatable. They're not kings and queens. They're not super rich. They're ordinary folk. I mean, Quixote himself is kind of an aging gentleman, but he's not admired or influential or powerful in any stretch. He's old and kind of gloopy, and he's got a few friends, but he's no Achilles. And he's accompanied on his journeys by a guy who is his squire. Quixote's problem is that he's been reading nothing but romances ever since he was a kid. He's been reading stories of knightly adventure, and he's now gotten old, and he's decided, he feels that his life has not been of any great value. And confronted with his own impending death, he decides to reject your reality and replace it with his own. That he is no longer going to be this aging gentleman. He's going to become a knight, and he is going to be a knight, and not just any knight. He is going to be a great knight who is going to have the greatest adventures ever. Thank you very much. With the most beautiful women and the most fantastic journeys and adversaries, and he will go down in history forever as the greatest knight in the world. He goes stark raving bonkers, in other words. And it's all blamed on the books that he's been reading. And in that sense, Don Quixote is a satire. Cervantes is saying, well, these books are ridiculous. What would happen if somebody tried to actually live their life according to the rules and regulations put forward in these books? He'd be a psycho. And we see that played out literally, in a literal sense, in the pages that follow. So Quixote says, oh, well, The book tells me how to treat women, so I'm going to treat women like that. And I'm going to treat every woman as if she was a princess. And so he meets a couple of prostitutes at the inn, and he treats them like princesses, and they just point and laugh at him. And he says, and I treat every man as if he was a gentleman, as if he was a lord. And the master of the inn, where these prostitutes are, thinks Quixote's crazy. And why are you talking to me like that? Why are you treating me like I'm some kind of royalty when I'm just the innkeeper? And at first it's just fun, but then it becomes more serious as Quixote begins to try to implement justice, because this, of course, is the job of the knight. The knight is an instrument of justice. And his job is to, the knight errant in these romances, his job is to sort of ride the countryside, righting wrongs. So when he comes across people, he beats them up, because that's what knights do. And as at one point, Don Quixote says very clearly, someone says, you're going to get thrown in prison for this. I think Sancho was his squire. Sancho Panza is the name of his squire. He's just this sort of not very smart, short, fat guy from the nearby countryside. And Quixote says, become my squire, because it'll totally be good for you, because, in all of these romances, the same thing always happens. The knight ends up conquering all these foreign lands, but, he can't run all these foreign places, and he conquers countries and nations, and then somebody has to run them, so he always gives them to his squire. So just hang out with me, and pretty soon, like within a couple of days, tops, I'm going to conquer an island or something, and I'll just give it to you, and then you can be prince of the island, and you'll be set. It's a done deal. And so Sancho's like, oh, I get to be prince of an island. Okay. And, he's not very smart, Sancho. And so Sancho goes along with Don Quixote. And Sancho Panza becomes a very interesting character, because he knows that his master sees things that don't exist. But Sancho also loves and admires his master. And readers will read this book and think, well, does Sancho actually believe that Don Quixote is a knight? Does he actually believe that Don Quixote is fighting a giant when it's really just windmills? Or does he get everything that's really going on, and he's just sort of going along with Quixote for some other reason? This is a very interesting question, and I we'll get to it later, but anyway, at one point, Sancho Panza says, well, Master, you can't just attack these people. You'll get thrown in prison. And Quixote laughs at him. He says, have you ever known a knight to be thrown in prison, no matter how many people they kill? Because that's exactly what happens in these books. The knights go berserk, and they kill 100 people inside some castle, and then they apologize for it, and they get off, and they walk away. This is very much in contrast to the actual truth of the matter, where the author of the great version of King Arthur in English, Sir Thomas Malory, who's a knight, wrote that book in prison because he was convicted of horse thievery and murder. And he spent years of his life in prison. He got caught in the political wars, in the War of the Roses between the two great families of England. And he got on the wrong side of that civil war, and he got thrown in prison. And while he was stuck in prison, he had nothing else to do, so he read and he wrote. In real life, plenty of knights got thrown in prison. In fact, you had to be rich to be thrown in prison. This is a bit off of our topic, but prisons cost money. Putting someone in a prison costs money. If you were poor, you didn't get put in prison because you didn't have any money to pay for it. Only rich people got put in prison because they had the money to afford to be put in prison. Poor people were just whipped or killed or executed or punished in some other physical, temporary way. Maybe they were held ransom so that somebody else could pay to have them released. This actually happened to Cervantes. He was held as a hostage, as a prisoner of war, until people back in Spain paid for him to be released. Um, Cervantes should have had a very successful political, social, intellectual career. He went into the government. He was well educated. But for some reason, he became passed over. He was dismissed from his government jobs for reasons that are not very clear. He suffered a kind of political and social exile, and he was living in poverty when he wrote Don Quixote and when it was published. We don't really know why this is. There's some allegations, you'll read about this in your book, that possibly Cervantes may have had some Jewish family. This is important because anti-Semitism, which is anti-Jewish prejudice and bigotry, was very present in Renaissance Spain, and there was also a strong anti-Muslim bigotry, largely because of the events we've just been talking about when we were talking about Ariosto, because of the long legacy of the Reconquista, that is the Christian attempt and eventual success in reconquering Spain from the Muslims who had controlled it since about the 7th century AD. That reconquest was very long. It took centuries. And prejudice against Islam was very strong. Could Cervantes have had some Jewish roots? Maybe that's why he couldn't get promoted. Maybe. We don't know. What we do know is that he presents Jews and Muslims in a very sympathetic way, or at least he portrays them as no more wicked or corrupt or greedy than everybody else in the book. Cervantes is like Chaucer in the sense that very few people get off looking good in Chaucer, and very few people get off looking good in Cervantes. And I think that's one of the reasons why his book has held up so well, because it's got a lot of cynicism in it, and it appeals to a modern audience who, when we read a book about somebody who's perfect, honorable, just, loyal, and true, it strikes us as unreal, as inauthentic. But when we read about somebody who wants to do good, but who is tripped up in their efforts to do good by common human failings, like a desire to sleep in a comfortable bed, or a desire to have more money than they need, or fine clothes or fine food, or someone who's distracted from great purpose by a desire for companionship and love, and who maybe does things in the pursuit of that love that are not very admirable. When we read about people like that, we recognize them as ourselves. And Cervantes is a genius at that. Don Quixote was an immense popular success. This was unusual. At first, people didn't quite know how to handle it because it doesn't fit any of the literary genres that came out before it. In fact, it quite obviously lampooned those genres. You'll remember that in a previous lecture, we talked about a bias against fiction. That is, there was a kind of ethical wrongness to fiction because it was lying. You're making up something that isn't true. How is that different than a lie? Now, plenty of people wrote fiction, but they had to engage in certain literary, established, accepted, and expected literary hoops to cover their moral and ethical behinds. So, for example, when Dante writes about a tour of hell, purgatory, and heaven, he doesn't say this actually happened to somebody. He doesn't even say this is a story about somebody else that I'm inventing. He says I had a dream, and in the dream this happened. That's okay. That's called a dream vision. Dreams, we dream all kinds of things in our dreams that don't happen. So it's okay to write about a dream. Now, Dante didn't actually have that dream, certainly not in that level of detail. So he's making that up. But it's a convention that everybody understands and accepts. And they know that he's making it up, but because it's a dream, it's okay. That make sense? And that seems like a little weird to us, but so Cervantes immediately addresses this at the very beginning of the book. He has this prologue, and you'll read it when you get to it. This prologue in which he says, I worked like hell on this book, but the hardest part I had to write was this prologue, because what am I going to say? You know, this is the part where everybody talks about all the other authors that they've read that inspired them and all of their sources, and how I'm, you know, and they pack it with quotes and citations of ancient people that have been dead for 1,000 years, and I don't have any of that stuff. I almost never quote a famous writer. I don't have any sources like that. But that's what people expect. You can't be a successful writer today, Cervantes says in this prologue, unless you follow the conventions of what everybody else is doing. Originality is bad. Conformity is good. And he makes fun of that. He pretends to say, oh, and that's great. That's exactly how it should be. But he's being satirical. He's being ironic. When you read this book, you should never think that Cervantes has a straight face. Okay? Don't read this book and presume that he's telling you what he really thinks, because he's playing with you. And it's a joke. And you're supposed to see that it's a joke, and you get it, and that's why you laugh. So he says at one point in the prologue, so, you know, like, I don't have a works cited. I don't have a bibliography where I list all the authors that my book is indebted to, which everybody had. Think back to that conversation from the wife of Bath. Remember, she was saying, like, you know, there's two ways to get information in this world. One of them is experience, the way that you live in the world, and you learn by experience. But the other is authority. And when she says authority, she means books. You cite the great masters of antiquity, and everything that you know and believe you get from books, from people that have been dead for hundreds of years. Which of those two does the wife of Bath think is more relevant and important? Experience, right? Because all the books were written by men. That's her point. Cervantes says, you know, I don't have any of those sources. What am I going to do? And he says, and I was struggling over this when this good friend of mine walks in, and he says, oh, well, that's easy. That's easy to solve. Just find somebody else's book that has a great big long bibliography and just copy theirs. He says, yeah, all right, you don't have a lot of quotes in your book, but you know what? Just steal a bunch of other people's quotes, because nobody, and when you come up, just make up the quotes. Just, you make up a quote and you say, oh, Plato said this, or Socrates said this, or whatever. Just make up all this stuff, because nobody checks anyway. It's all bullshit. So just make it all up. And Cervantes tells us this in the prologue and says, and so I did. Right? So you see what he's getting at. He exposes all of these other writers as complete frauds. And then he says, and then I was a fraud just like them. So he's self-deprecating and satirical at the same time. He and Chaucer, they're like two peas in a pod, man. Um, Don Quixote was extraordinarily popular. We mentioned this. So popular, in fact, that somebody else wrote a sequel. In fact, there were multiple attempts to write sequels to Don Quixote. The first book does not end with Quixote's death. It ends with him. You know, this guy goes crazy. He goes out on nightly adventures. He gets caught and brought back home. Happens a couple of times. Finally, at the end of the first book, he's brought back home, and his loved ones put him to bed and sort of say, well, maybe he'll be okay in the morning. But it ends with this very obvious sort of sequel moment where, you know, it may as well be a horror movie where the hand comes up out of the grave. You know, I think Cervantes says, and everyone was afraid that he would just go crazy again and ride off on another adventure, which is exactly what happened. I mean, it's his last lines in the book are a paraphrase of that. So we know that he goes off to have more adventures, but Cervantes didn't write anything more. But somebody else did. Okay, now this is the 1600s. This is before trademark and copyright law. There was no legal mechanism for preserving someone's creative work. There was no intellectual property law. This has very specific and obvious effects on a lot of the literature of this time period. For example, when Shakespeare writes a play that's original, let's say Midsummer Night's Dream, because that's one of the only two plots that he didn't steal from another source. Let's say that he writes a play that's an original plot, Midsummer Night's Dream. Okay, so you've got Titania and Oberon, and you've got... Okay. Within a day, somebody else will have a ripped-off version of his play playing at a rival playhouse in the same city. Right? Because you're an actor. You're an actor or a playwright in Shakespeare's England. You know that this Shakespeare guy, he's one of the very few people that are really writing successful plays right now. There's not that very many people in the business. They all know each other. They all hang out at the same bars. They all pay the same bar tabs. They're all a very small community of writers. So you hear that Shakespeare's got a new play. You go to see the play, and during the whole play, you're either remembering the scenes or you're making notes or both. And that night, after the play's over, you run home, you copy out a bad version or a ripped-off version, and you add whatever stuff of your own you think, oh, that scene could totally have been better here. Oh, what if the plot went like this? And you revise their plot to fit your own. You keep the best parts, add some of your own, and then you get your actors grouped together and say, okay, here's our version of Shakespeare's new play. And then you put it on as soon as the actors can learn the lines. And this happened with every play that came out. Not only was it done to Shakespeare, Shakespeare did it to other people. So, for example, there was a play called Hamlet before Shakespeare's Hamlet. How much of that Hamlet did Shakespeare write that previous version of Hamlet, which is lost to us, by the way? We don't have it anymore. Did Shakespeare write that Hamlet, or was it somebody else's Hamlet, and Shakespeare took that plot and wrote his Hamlet a couple of years later? The answer is we don't know. Well, Cervantes' Don Quixote was so popular that some other people started to write their own Don Quixote books. Today we would call it fan fiction. Fan fiction is very old. Don Quixote might be one of the earliest examples of it, but Sherlock Holmes is another great example. Any one of you today could go out and write a Sherlock Holmes novel. Why is that? Because Sherlock Holmes is in the public domain. He's a publicly owned character. He's owned by everybody in the world. Intellectual property law for centuries. Well, I have to be careful here of how I date this. For a very long time, intellectual property law stated that your characters that you invent were yours for approximately a human lifespan, about 70 years. And that way, you could make all the money you wanted off of those characters, but eventually, those characters would go into the public domain. And they would then belong to humanity. They would belong to everyone. You could still make your fortune, but, after you're dead, they don't belong to you anymore. When big entertainment businesses got into this, the law began to change. Walt Disney owns characters like Peter Pan, Winnie the Pooh, Cinderella, characters that will never go into public domain because that 70-year deadline just keeps getting extended and extended and extended because companies like Walt Disney, which now own Marvel and Pixar and I mean, there's so many of these fictional characters are owned by a relatively small number of very powerful corporations. Well, is Walt Disney going to allow Mickey Mouse to go into the public domain? I mean, by the original intellectual property laws, Mickey Mouse would have gone to the public domain decades ago. And anybody in the world could write a Mickey Mouse comic or make a Mickey Mouse cartoon. Well, that's never going to happen, right? And so these laws have changed. But a lot of these older characters, and I'm talking again about characters like Holmes or even Cervantes, those characters are old enough that they have gone into public domain before the law started to change. So Cervantes, he had none of this protection. Somebody else could write a Don Quixote novel, and they did. And he felt that he was losing money and that his character had been stolen. So he decided the only way to solve this was to write his own sequel and kill the character. That way, nobody else could write any more Don Quixote novels. Well, of course, it didn't work because people just wrote them anyway, even though the character was technically and officially dead. So what? Even in that sense, Don Quixote's books fall into this pattern of romance because one of the distinguishing features of the romance is this idea of a continuation. For example, some of the greatest romances are unfinished. Chrétien de Troyes, the great medieval French writer who wrote Lancelot's Knight of the Cart, which is where the character of Lancelot was really created, and the whole romantic affair with the queen, all that stuff comes out of Chrétien's Knight of the Cart. He also wrote a great knightly romance called Percival. This is the poem in which the Holy Grail first appears. Everybody's heard of the Holy Grail, right? Well, Chrétien de Troyes. Percival is not finished. It's long, but at some point, Chrétien for some reason, we don't know why, he stopped finishing it. He stopped writing it. So various other writers over the centuries tried to come in and finish it, and there's 5 or 6 different Percival continuations that try to finish that story or wrap it up or take it in a brand new direction. Some of them are very loyal to Chrétien, some of them are not. Some of them are short continuations, they wrap at the end of the book. Some of them go on 3 times longer than any of the stuff that Chrétien wrote. So in that sense, when someone else takes over Don Quixote and starts writing a continuation, well, that's the genre. Don Quixote was very, we mentioned this very briefly, we'll just touch on it again, was so unusual for its time that people didn't really know how to respond and react to it. They didn't know whether it seemed like a romance, it pretends to be a romance, but then it makes fun of the romance. And it's not about these aristocratic figures, it's about these ordinary people. It's about bandits and prostitutes and innkeepers and servants. This sort of thing, this prose novel, and that's really what Don Quixote is. It's a novel. Was brand new. And that made it took a little while for people to figure out how to respond to it and how to read it. As you read, you're going to see all of these moments which pit reality versus the illusion. The reality of the windmills versus the illusion of the giants. The sheep versus the soldiers, the armies, the innkeeper who Don Quixote sees as a castellan, as a great lord who can knight him. This is how Don Quixote gets knighted, is that he asks the innkeeper to knight him. As you're reading all of that, think back to other things that we have read that touch on this question of illusion and the power of imagination. And I'm talking about Montaigne, right? Montaigne talks about it, and it comes up in other things that we've read, and it'll come up again in Hamlet when we talk about Hamlet. What did Montaigne say about the imagination and its power? This is my dog Frankie. You guys have already met her. Frankie, say hi. What is Cervantes saying about it? Are any of these people characterizing the power of the imagination as basically good or basically bad? What are they saying about it other than it's powerful? We can agree on that the imagination is very strong, okay? Then what, right? These are questions that I think are worth asking as you read. Is Don Quixote's madness purely negative? It makes him a laughable character. Everybody that meets him laughs at him. But by the end of the book, it also makes him, it doesn't even take that long, an admirable character. Because Quixote is acting with nobility and honor and virtue in a world that doesn't respect any of those virtues. But wouldn't it be nice if the world did? In other words, he's acting like a good person. He's trying to be a good person. And he's unappreciated for that. But shouldn't he be appreciated? There is something noble about Quixote, despite his lunacy and his laughableness. The fact that every time he gets in a fight, well, after the first couple of fights, for the first couple of fights, he actually wins when he gets in fights. And I think that Cervantes decided that he was just winning too often. So he makes Don Quixote lose his sword, and his armor gets all stolen, and he ends up using nothing but a stick and doesn't even have a helmet. And so he has to sort of take weapons away from Don Quixote so that Quixote doesn't start beating up on innocent people. But for most of the book, whenever Quixote gets in a fight, he ends up flat on his back, getting the stuffing kicked out of him by bandits or by just local people that happen to be there. So he's failing because the world is cruel and hard, and it doesn't tolerate crazy people who try to be good. It only rewards corruption and greed and selfishness. There's a point where someone says, "Well, I couldn't possibly take a bribe," and another person in the book says, "Well, if you did, you should, because if you did, you'd totally get ahead. I mean, that's how you get ahead in the world, is to take a bribe. That's how the world works." The world of Cervantes has fallen, and that might be true, but that doesn't make it right. We've already talked about the introduction, the prologue to Don Quixote. There's a couple of things going on there. One of them is this question of authority versus experience, which Cervantes frames as homage to past authors, tradition versus originality. He continues to maintain the fiction that the book is not fiction, that it's taken from another book, that there really was a Don Quixote and I have a book that talks about that person's life and I'm just copying it. That's fake. That's bogus. It's a lie. And Cervantes' readers knew it was a lie. And Cervantes knew it was a lie. But he pretends that it's a truth so that he can make fun of it. Okay. Let's pause very briefly, and we'll come back and talk about some of the key scenes in Don Quixote. And we'll try to move fairly quickly, but we'll have a lot to say about them, okay? Back in a minute. All right, folks, we're back, and we're going to start working our way through some of Don Quixote here. So our text starts on 391. It begins with a line from the book excerpted. The title is not, this title chapter is not in, rewind here. The title of this chapter is chosen by the translator, not by Cervantes. It reads, I know who I am and who I may be if I choose. It's a line that Quixote says later on, and today we say, you know, I reject your reality and replace it with my own. You know, that this, it raises the question of self-fashioning your own identity. Are you who you are born as? Or are you who you choose to be? Now, you know, in American culture, we're very used to this idea of social mobility. Whether or not that's true anymore is another question, which we will leave for another day. But this idea that anyone can become rich, anyone can choose to be anything they want to do, a son of a black son of a single mother can grow up to become president of the United States. You know, that you can be anything. You are not stuck with the hand that you were dealt. And Quixote becomes a champion of that argument. You'll quickly find Quixote spends a lot of time struggling with the literature that he's reading. He reads these romances, but they're very hard. The language is hard, and Quixote is like you. He's a reader, and he has a hard time with the romances that he's reading, and he doesn't understand them. In other literature that we've read, we've come back to this question of whether or not literature should be easy or hard. Should it use simple words and approachable language that everybody gets? Should it be in the language of the present day? Should it be in English, for example, or Italian if you're Dante, or French, or should it be in, you know, Latin or Greek? Should it use difficult vocabulary and hard? Should it be language that you have to struggle to keep up with, or should it be language that you don't even think about? Well, there's arguments on both sides of this, and I don't want to present this as a one-answer question, but it's a question that's brought up in the book itself. Does truth equal fact? If so, fiction equals lies. Can there be truth in fiction? This is a central question of Don Quixote. Can I tell a story that isn't factual, but yet contains truth? I tell you a story. There's this young guy and this girl, and he's maybe 18 and she's maybe 16. And they grow up in different neighborhoods and they run with different crowds. And her parents are rich and his friends are all gang members. And they meet at a party and they immediately feel attracted to one another. But they know that their parents wouldn't approve, their families and their friends wouldn't approve. His gang member friends, they would go ballistic if they found out. They'd do all kinds of things to him in revenge if they found out. Her parents already have another family sort of idea for her to marry into. They don't want her to, be looking at this no good guy. And so the two people they decide that they're going to secretly get married, and they run away. They cross the state border, and they go to some place where they can get married in real short notice. They go to Vegas or whatever, and they check into a hotel room, and they get married. And then they realize that, if when our parents are going to find out, it's going to come out. And when it does, everything is going to go miserable. If we're never going to be able to be together. So this story can only really have one ending. Let's just finish it now. And they take a bottle of pills and a bottle of JD, and they're dead by morning. Now, I made up that story. That story is Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare made up that story. It didn't really happen. But is there some truth with a capital T, in it? Don Quixote does not see facts. Don Quixote sees fiction. But in our reading of his adventures, does he show us something that is true? Quixote decides that every knight has a young woman. Every knight has a lover whom they adore, and so he has to have one. So he picks this farm girl that he kind of got a crush on when he was younger. She has no idea he exists. She doesn't know anything about him. And she never appears in this book. And he gives her a new name. He calls her Dulcinea. Her real name is Aldonza. He calls her Dulcinea. And he decides that she must be a princess. And he will invoke her name countless times in the book that follows. What's going on here? We're lampooning the whole Angelica Orlando kind of thing, right? It's going to come back again later on in a very important section that's in our reading. Just to show you that men don't understand women, Quixote is going to proclaim his undying love for a woman who doesn't even appear in the book. The early sections of the book include many of the most famous sections, including the windmill fight, for example, when Don Quixote sees a windmill and decides that it's a giant, and he goes to fight it. He rides up on his horse. Now, his horse is called Rocinante, which is a pun in Spanish. The word rocin means like a nag or a hack. A hack is just a word that means like a really run-down horse. So Rocinante means like the hack of all hacks. Like, if we were going to name it, we'd have to think of a super hack, Hackosaurus Rex, some kind of ridiculous superlative that made it sound like the greatest of all possible bad horses. Okay. Anyway, he rides up to the windmill on Rocinante, and he tries to stab it with his lance, and things work out poorly, and he ends up flat on his back, and as he often does in these fights. And he decides that, well, clearly, uh, the giant has been transformed into a windmill by my evil wizard adversary, whom he invents out of nothing, uh, who wishes. Now, why would they do this? Why would an evil wizard transform the giant into a windmill as I was getting ready to fight it? And the answer is, well, to deprive me of the glory of defeating it. By turning it into a windmill, he has prevented my adventure from occurring and thus robbed me of my victory. This becomes a very convenient excuse for much of the things that happen later, where Quixote suddenly, after he's defeated, looks up and sees that what he thought was an evil knight or whatever isn't what he thought it was, and now he has to explain why he's lost. As ridiculous as Quixote is, he is happy. He wears old rusted armor from his grandfather. He needs a visor for his helmet, so he makes one out of cardboard and he ties on with little ribbons, and it can't be removed because if you undo the ribbons, the whole thing will fall apart. So he has to eat through a straw, and then women have to feed him with like forks and spoons up through his helmet because the thing can't come off. And he could not be happier. He is a laughing stock. He is a completely ridiculous figure, and yet he himself in his world is not just content, but delighted, the happiest he has ever been. Which makes us wonder, well then, maybe we should just let him do it. And then he becomes like us, right? If you choose to believe what you believe, and it's laughable, but it makes you happy, it gives you a sense of personal contentment, well, where's the harm? This is an attitude that I think our generation appreciates. That kind of live and let live attitude. You will see this issue about horses. We talked about Rocinante earlier. When every time that Quixote loses control of Rocinante and the horse goes off and Don Quixote ends up flat on his back, it's a callback to these moments in the great romances when knights lose control of their horses. And as we talked about before, it becomes a metaphoric point about the man's inability to control his own power. It's ironic in this case because Quixote has no power to control. He's weak and helpless. He's a terrible fighter. And he's defeated by everybody he encounters after the first few fights. He wins a little bit at the beginning. But then he perpetually loses. But he still can't control his power. But this question of lack of control, this is not irrelevant to Quixote, right? Because he is also out of control. He has lost control of his senses. He cannot control his own mind. He's gone mad. He is Quixote Furioso, right? Quixote gone crazy. When Orlando goes crazy, we feel sympathy for him, but only so that he can be cured. He becomes this sort of inhuman Hulk when he goes crazy. He starts tearing up trees and destroying everything he comes across. Quixote's craziness is sympathetic craziness. He doesn't hurt innocent people. He's a better person when he's crazy than he is when he's sane. It's ironic, and that means that makes the end of the book, or I should say the end of book 2, all the more tragic. We'll get to that. Don Quixote is a terribly influential book, incredibly important, also on American culture. There have been film versions, novel adaptations. There's a long-running Broadway musical called The Man of La Mancha, based on Don Quixote, with Frank Sinatra. One of his signature songs, My Way, I Did It My Way, comes from this musical based on Don Quixote. And of course, they take a few liberties with the book. Dulcinea shows up. She's this barmaid. He meets her. He declares her his love forever. And she's like, who are you? What are you talking about? So she's actually in the musical as opposed to not being in the book. But this idea that I did it my way, that I may not be always successful in what I do, but I approach the world on my own terms. It's a very appealing and a very American notion. And you can see why this book was so appealing. Let's talk a little bit about Sancho and Sancho Panza. We brought him up earlier, and I promised we would get back to him, so let's do that now. Sancho never lets Quixote forget that, you promised me an island, master. And he says, but I don't think I would be a very good prince, because I just can't keep track of that many things. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. It's all very complicated. And Quixote says, well, all right, you don't have to be a prince, but you shouldn't settle for a title that's too low, because you're my squire and I'm a great knight, and I just can't have a squire who's a nobody. You're gonna have to moderate your humility. It's a great scene. Sancho's concerns are very practical. He's concerned with, are they getting enough food to eat, enough water to drink? Do they have shade to sleep in and a roof over their head? He's got a wife whom he's left and kids whom he's left, but he's left them because with Quixote he believes that he will get money and wealth, and then he will return to his wife and kids, and they will all be comfortable for the rest of their lives. So he has left his family, and I don't mean to say that Sancho isn't, without stain here. He's a deadbeat dad, but he has a good reason. He's doing it because if he can succeed in this quest, then he will come back and he will be able to provide his family with wealth, all the wealth they could ever want, forever. Sancho never sees the illusions, the fantasies that his master sees, but he wants to believe them. He desperately wants the windmills to be giants. He wants the sheep to be knights, because if those things are true, then Sancho's dream of financial security will also come true. And if they are not true, if the windmill is just a windmill, then Sancho is an idiot and his dream is a fantasy. Sancho is more of a reader identification character. And the degree to which you read this book and you begin to wish that Quixote was right, the degree to which you feel that is the degree to which you become like Sancho Panza, who's the witness to all of Quixote's actions. The man who takes care of Quixote when Quixote is injured, and he's always injured. The man who still needs to eat and sleep and drink and do all those things that Quixote has given off, because he never eats anymore. He says he doesn't need to. He survives on the strength of his love, his purity. Sancho's like, yeah, well, I need some beef in me. You know? uh, Sancho is a kind of reader identification character. And he loves his master in the way that we come to love Quixote, even though he's laughable. Sancho was always, like the reader, he's always skeptical. He says, well, it doesn't look like a giant to me, master. Are you sure it's a giant? Because it looks like a windmill. And Quixote, well, clearly, you've been bespelled or something. Someone's cast an evil spell on you that you can't tell a giant is a giant. I don't know what your problem is, but I'm riding in there. All right. At the end of chapter 8, Quixote's in a fight with another guy, just a guy on the road. And the fight's ludicrous. They're fighting with sticks, and one of the guys has lost his helmet, so he's got like a pillowcase on his head, and they're like it's a comedy of idiots, sort of fighting. None of them are effective fighters. They're all they're like schoolyard nerds trying to fight. It's just like it's ridiculous. It's a joke. But because this is a romance, a satire, this fight is blown into huge proportion as if it was a mighty duel between tremendous opponents. So right when the fight is at its most climactic, and we're on the edge of our seats, or we would be if it was a real fight. Instead, we're just amazed at the comedy of it all. Suddenly, the book breaks off, and Cervantes says, and here's where my source material, the book that I'm copying all of this out of, because remember the pretense that he's created, that all of these medieval fiction authors had followed, that they weren't inventing a new story, but they were telling you a story that they found in a lost, mysterious book, which in fact did not exist. Anyway, Cervantes says, and now the book that I'm copying this out of, it ends right here. It leaves us all hanging. What am I going to do? And it's a way to build suspense, but he's also drawing attention to these conventions of the genre that we all know are bogus, but we all laugh at. So then he introduces this new idea, and it's the whole beginning of chapter 9 that you'll read. Like, oh, I was walking through a bookstore one day, and I found another copy of this book, of the story of Don Quixote. But it was all written in Arabic. Now remember, this is Spain, which had been conquered by the Arabs, by the Muslims, and for hundreds of years had been part of the Islamic Empire. But now, in 1600s, had been Christian for centuries. So I found this copy of Don Quixote, but it's all in Arabic, and I can't read Arabic. So I found an Arab knight, who could translate it for me. Okay, so now let me get this straight. You're reading a story written by Cervantes, given to him by an Arab who's translating a book written in Arabic by somebody else who was presumably translated from another previous version, which was not Arab. Is the protagonist a Muslim? No. So does that mean that when Don Quixote comes off looking like an idiot in the book, is that because he really is an idiot? Or is it because this Islamic translator is giving a bad translation on purpose to make the Christian guy look like an idiot? Now, the fact that all of these characters don't exist, and Cervantes is making up the whole thing himself, was known to all of his readers. But it's part of the game. And what he's suggesting is, well, what if there were? What if there was a book out there in which Don Quixote was brave and honorable and strong, and he won all of these fights, and he was good, and he was a champion of the oppressed, and all of these things that he's seeing as fake were real. Maybe that's the real book. But this Arab guy, because, you know, those Muslims can't be trusted, and he's poking fun at this. He's poking fun at bigots, because none of these characters are real. That Muslim guy, that Muslim, he's the one that made Don Quixote into a fool. Don Quixote's a hero. But this translator guy, he's the one that did all the damage. Of course, Cervantes is both of those characters, both of those authors. All right. He will continue to call truth into question, fact and illusion into question throughout the book. Okay. We're going to move on to the major section of our reading. It occupies several chapters. It's a romance between Marcella, the woman, and a shepherd named Grisostomo. Now, these people are shepherds, and there's a song in the book. It's on page 429, a ballad. This is a romance trope. Many of these romances have pastoral aspects where aristocratic figures, knights or whatever, counts, dukes, end up retiring to a sort of quiet life in the countryside where they hide from all of their knightly convictions or commitments. And it's portrayed as a kind of idyllic, peaceful space where they can escape the responsibilities and pursue romantic interests. Sometimes these retreats are voluntary, sometimes they're forced. Think in Ariosto about, you know, the Angelica and her man who fell in love because they had to retreat to this secret grotto after he was injured, and she was taking care of him, and in her taking care of him, she falls in love. That retreat with all the trees and all their names, like Angelica loves, you know, what's his name? That's another aspect, another example of this pastoral quality of the romance, this kind of secret woodland nature space away from the city where the knight doesn't have to be a knight and the woman doesn't have to be a princess, and they can just be man and woman falling in love, doing what men and women have done since there were men and women. Okay. All right, so what we find out plot-wise, this is a complicated sort of story, and there's a lot going on here, so sort of let's skim through the plot. Marcella, the woman, is fantastically beautiful and is adored and admired and sought and pursued by many men. In other words, she's like Angelica. Okay, think of her as Quixote's or as Cervantes' riff on the Angelica trope. Okay. But she doesn't want to love any of these people. All these men are chasing her, and she doesn't want them. She's not interested. And so she has retreated from society to the woods, where she's a shepherdess. She takes care of a flock of sheep. And one of those men, actually many of those men pursue her. They come out to the pastoral, to the farmland, to find her and to try to court her and woo her and make her theirs. She rejects all of them. One of these men, Grisostomo, has died for his unrequited love of Marcella. Now, did he really die of heartbreak, or did he take his own life? Or, you know, in the romance, you can say that somebody just dies of love. Here in the real world, we know that usually requires something a little bit more pointed than that. Whether or not he took his own life is sort of irrelevant. The blame he has placed on Marcella. It's her fault that he's dead because she did not requite his love. And all these other guys are there. And Quixote comes upon all of this. He comes upon the funeral. And they're burying Grisostomo, and they're singing his songs, and they're lamenting this poor guy who died because this woman wouldn't love him. And it's all very sympathetic to the man until Marcella shows up at the funeral. And she says, look, she has this great defense of her sovereignty. She says, look, I didn't ask for any of these people to follow me. In fact, I left the city specifically so that this would not happen. Every time Grisostomo or any of these other guys have tried to come on to me, I have told them to get lost. I'm not interested. I don't want a husband. I'm not even interested in anybody. I want no love at all. So how is this my fault? Is it my fault that I'm beautiful? Look, I don't dress in fancy clothes. I don't even try to take care of myself. I just live out here in the woods. I don't encourage these men in any way. And yet they won't shut up. They won't stop. They don't accept no for an answer. No means no. And it's not my fault that he's dead. It's his fault. And all these other guys that are heartbroken and pining away from me, it's not my fault. This is a very powerful defense, and it calls into question all of those romances that we have read as readers of the romance. When we read about these guys chasing these women, we never stop to think about, well, what if the woman doesn't want to love him? And for many of these authors, that's not an issue because the love is natural. When Little Richard pulls his bed swap trick and pretends to be his sister who's gotten a magical sex change, the woman that he's pursuing is totally happy with that. She returns the affection, and Richard returns the affection, and their love is perfect. But love isn't like that. People have free will. They have choices, and they get to decide. And it's usually the women who end up going along with whatever the guy wants in these books. And Cervantes is showing that to us when he introduces this articulate, sophisticated, well-reasoned woman who says, look, all I want is to be able to decide who I love. And it's the wife of Bath's voice coming out, in a totally different kind of character. Marcella is as far from the wife of Bath as you can imagine. The wife of Bath has had 5 husbands, and she knows every sex trick there is. That's what as we read. But Marcella, she says, look, I get to decide who I love, and if I don't love you, well, get over it. At this moment, as readers and as a writer, Cervantes is at a critical moment because how is Quixote going to react to all of this? Quixote is a reader of the romance. He's grown up on these romances. They are what have caused him to go insane. So what's he going to do? Now, if he sides with the dead guy and says, oh, you should have loved him, it's all your fault, he's dead, he stays loyal to the romances, but he becomes a jerk, right? Because Marcella's right. She's morally and ethically in the right. But if Quixote sides with her, he becomes admirable, but he damns the romances that have made him what he is. Well, so who does Quixote side with? He sides with Marcel. He not only does he allow this woman to go free, he says if anybody else chases her, if any man chases her, and this is exactly what Orlando Furioso is based on, remember, is everybody chasing after Angelica. She comes into the room, she gets kidnapped, she gets whisked away across Europe, and every guy in Charlemagne's court starts to follow her. He says, if anybody chases this woman, I'm going to personally hunt them down. It's like he's short-circuiting the entire plot of a novel. Because Quixote knows what is right. And yeah, he's crazy. But he knows what's right. And Marcella is right. Read the sequence for yourself. It's a few chapters long. Read the whole thing. You should be able to follow how the argument goes. The comparisons to Ariosto and other romances are very specific. We already talked about the Angelica, everybody chasing Angelica. There's even a moment where Marcella's name has been written in trees over and over and over again, just like that moment where Angelica and her lover's name have been written in the trees over and over again. I mean, the references in these books are things that we as readers would pick up on and recognize at once. We would see that conversation taking place in front of us between 1,000 years of romances and Cervantes. In a secondary section, further on from there, Quixote attempts to defend the nobility. We talked about this in a previous lecture. Social order and social structure in the Renaissance was rapidly changing and destabilizing. If there's an aristocracy in charge, there are knights and dukes and kings in charge in all these countries, Spain and Italy and France, England. Why are they in charge? How do they stay in charge? They stay in charge because they have the military power, because they have the armor and the horses, and they're trained killers. They also stay in power because they're rich. Well, as the Renaissance progressed, these two things became less and less true. Yes, knights still had armor and horses, and they were still trained killers. But you can train a person how to use a handgun in a day, and a bullet will kill a knight from 100 yards. The military supremacy that vindicated the knight was wearing away. At the same time, a rising merchant middle class, prompted by trade with foreign nations in the Mediterranean, but also across the Atlantic, across the Atlantic and to India and China. A rising middle class put more and more of the wealth there instead of the aristocracy. So at the same time that the aristocracy was becoming less dominant in a military sense, they were also becoming less dominant in a financial sense. And a deep anxiety began to grow up amongst the aristocracy and the nobility, vindicating their role. Why should they still be in charge? If you're not the kings of the battlefield anymore, and you're not the richest guys anymore, then why are you still in charge? And Quixote's answer is, well, because we're good people. Now, think back to Machiavelli. Remember how Machiavelli's book was so different than all of the other political books of the time, because all those political books, the sort of Mirror of Princes genre, argued that to be a good ruler, you needed to be a good person. And the degree to which you were a good person would also make you a good ruler. The better you were at one, the better you'd be at the other. Machiavelli says, well, that's bullshit. But this is the argument that Cervantes, whose mind is still in the medieval period, falls back on. He says, no, if you're a good person, you're a good ruler. And that's why the nobility is the nobility, because they're noble. Not in the sense of rich, but in the sense of good. And when we read that, we just think, oh, if only he were right? If only our rulers were all good people. There's a point where Quixote praises a beautiful woman. He praises Dulcinea. He says, her beauty is superhuman. I'm on page 438. For in it are realized all the impossible and chimerical attributes that poets are accustomed to give their fair ones. Her locks are golden, her brow the Elysian fields, her eyebrows rainbows, her eyes suns, her cheeks roses, her lips coral, her teeth pearls, her neck alabaster, her bosom marble, her hands ivory, her complexion snow white. Okay, all of those things are not people. She's mostly objects of value. Everybody say hi to my other dog. This is Byron. Byron, say hi to the crowd. She's gold and coral and marble and alabaster. She's an object, or at best, a collection of objects, all smushed together. Secondly, she sounds kind of freaky. I mean, if you imagine for a minute all of these things were actually combined in one person, it would be a monster, like a special effects extravaganza. When Quixote does this, it's a satire of the dehumanization and the pat cliches of love that we read, for example, in the love poetry when we were reading love sonnets, and you read Petrarch, and then you read Shakespeare's sonnet where he says, oh, my love is nothing like the sun, right? All that stuff that Shakespeare was parodying, that he was satirizing, Cervantes is satirizing the same thing, but in a different way, in prose, and with exaggeration, rather than inversion. Shakespeare's inversion. Okay, let's oh yeah, here on page 445 is where the whole business with Marcella and Grisostomo plays out, and she says, I was born a free being. I was born a free being. I get to decide. I do not wish to be subject to another in any way. He who calls me a wild beast, let him leave me alone, as something that is evil and harmful. If I am cruel, do not run after me. Marcella has to say this because the behavior of the men in these books is always exactly the opposite. They call the women cruel and then chase them. Oh, you're so cruel. You're so hard on me. Give me more of that. I just want to call out very briefly one example of the humor of these books. I've said before that you probably won't laugh at a lot of Don Quixote, but maybe you will. I'm on page 449. Quixote has seen two flocks of sheep, and he imagines them as armies. And he begins to list all the knights in all these armies. And of course, one of them is all made of foreigners, and the other one is all made of Christians. But he imagines all of these knights, and he begins to describe their flamboyant and colorful outfits and all of their symbols. Here's one of them. But turn your eyes in this direction, and you will behold, at the head of the other army, the ever victorious, never vanquished, Taimanel de Carcajona, Prince of New Biscay, who comes with quartered arms. That means his shield is cut into 4 pieces. His shield is 4 parts. azure, vert, argent, and ore. That's blue, green, silver, and gold. And who has upon his shield a cat, or a gold cat, on a field tawny, with the inscription Meow, which is the beginning of his lady's name, for she, so it is said, is the peerless Mulina. Okay, it's the night of the kitty cat, and he's got a cat on his shield, and his war cry is meow. Okay, all right, come on, it's funny. It's a little funny, especially if you're a cat lover. The last sequence that we need to talk about, it's chapter 22. Quixote comes across a group of prisoners being taken to the galleys. Spain's military power was largely dependent on its fleet. It had a massive naval fleet called the Armada, or the Great Armada, which was so vast in size that it was a kind of ultimate weapon in terms of geopolitical power. The fact that Queen Elizabeth survived the Armada, because Queen Elizabeth was a Protestant ruler and Spain was a Catholic country. So soon after Elizabeth rose to the throne, the Armada decided, Spain decided to invade in an attempt to conquer England for Catholicism, for religious purposes. The Armada, however, got hit by a terrible storm, and about 2/3 of the ships sank in the storm, and the remainder were fought off by a couple of Elizabeth's most famous captains who led the defense. This is seen as a miracle in England. It was a huge feather in Elizabeth's cap, and it made her, it secured her militarily, probably for a generation. Well, all of those boats need sailors, and Spain had an insatiable need for crewmen for these boats, many of them which were galleys. They're rowed because, ship that big, you just can't depend on sails all the time. You got to get someplace. The wind's not in your favor. You're going to have to row. Well, how do we get these sailors? Well, we use prisoners. We use convicts. And we punish them by making them row in the galleys. And your average lifespan in the galley was about 5 to 7 years. And then you were usually dead. So Quixote comes across a group of these men who are all being taken from the prison to the galleys where they had been sentenced. And this prompts a long investigation of criminal justice and societal justice and punishment. We talked earlier that it can be hard to read Quixote because he has all these little adventures and they all sort of bleed into one another. Marcella's story, these convicts' story, and so on. The trick to reading this is don't read it like one book. Read it, each individual section has its own theme and its own point Cervantes is trying to make. Okay, the Marcella stuff about the shepherdess and the guys that have died for her, that's his feminism chapters, right? When he talks about women and the way that women are treated in society and their lack of a voice and their desire to have a voice. These chapters with the prisoners is his section on social justice and the rule of law and the injustices of our system. Try and compartmentalize them like that. And it takes a few chapters for him to usually get through each one of these sections. So it's not a chapter by chapter thing, but it's more like a plot point, right? That might help as you read to keep these things separated. Like, okay, these are the pages where he's talking about this issue, his theme for these issues, his point. And then he'll move on to a different point and leave all the other stuff behind. one of the criminals is a pimp and a sorcerer. And Cervantes, or Quixote says, well, okay, he's a sorcerer, he goes to jail. But he shouldn't go to jail because he's a pimp. He says, pimp is a distinguished and honorable occupation. He says, in fact, it's an occupation that's so important that only noblemen should be able to do it, and it should be licensed, and we should regulate how many people can be pimps, because the main problem is that we have too many people trying to do it, and they haven't been trained. They're really bad at it. What is this all about? Okay, this is a reference. This is, again, a romantic trope. Whenever you have these men and women who are having affairs, and I'm talking about Lancelot and Guinevere, for example, or any other of these characters who are usually the knight is the inferior and the woman is the superior, but she's married, and you have to have somebody that goes between these two people to carry messages, for example, right? Who's gonna be the go-between that helps to arrange the meetings? That's what Quixote is talking about when he talks about a pimp, and he's specifically referencing the first of all of these characters, which, okay, you have to think your mind back. Think back to Troy, right? Oh yeah, Troy. Remember we're back there? One of the warriors in Troy is a guy named Troilus. His name literally means Little Troy. And Troilus falls in love with a Greek woman whose father is a soothsayer in the Greek camp. And her name is Cressida, or Crusade. And Chaucer wrote a version of Troilus and Cressida, and Shakespeare wrote a play, Troilus and Cressida, and this story is very well known. It's sort of Romeo and Juliet-ish. You know, you have like this woman from the Greek and the guy from the Trojans, and they fall in love, but their love is doomed, right? Well, the go-between for these two people is Troilus's uncle, whose name is Pandarus. Pandarus. We actually read him. He showed up in the Iliad parts that we read. He gets killed by Diomedes or something. Well, this is where the word pander comes from. To pander is to sort of, well, it literally means to pimp. To pander someone is to solicit someone else to have sex with that person. Like, I'm going to pander. In this case, Pandarus is pandering Troilus to Crusade. He's selling his nephew sexually. That's where the word pander comes from. So when Quixote defends the role of the pander, the pimp, you know, he's sticking up for the literature. And of course, making some jokes at the same time. But in our era today, where we're talking about legalizing a lot of things with the idea that, well, why don't we just tax it, legalize it and tax it, and then we can regulate it, and everybody will be better off and make some money while we're at it. I don't think this argument sounds so weird. Okay. One of the prisoners stands out from all the others because he's especially heavily chained and manacled, and he's more dangerous than all of the others. He turns out he's a famous bandit. This famous bandit, it turns out, is also an author. He has written his life story. He wrote it in prison. You remember at the beginning of the lecture we were talking about this guy named Mallory who wrote the King Arthur stories? And he was a knight. And he was also a convicted horse thief and guilty of murder. And he was thrown in prison. And it was in prison that he wrote all of his King Arthur stories. Yeah. This is familiar, right? And even Cervantes may have even spent some time in prison. We know he spent some time in prison. He may have even written in prison. We don't know. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most dangerous of all of the prisoners also happens to be an author who has written his life story in prison. Cervantes is calling out Mallory and making a joke that readers of the romances would get. Okay. So after Quixote has interrogated all these prisoners and he's found out what all their crimes are, he can't figure out, he's confused by this whole situation because the prisoners are being led by guards to the galleys. And Quixote can't figure out, well, where's the king in all of this? He says at one point, the men say that these are a chain of galley slaves, people on their way to the galleys, where by order of the king they are forced to labor. Quixote says, I'm on top of 452. What do you mean by forced? Asked Don Quixote. Is it possible that the king uses force on anyone? And Sancho, who's the one talking here, he's trying to placate his master, so he sort of minces words and dances around it. But the Quixote can't figure out, why would the king have to force justice? In the romances that he's used to reading, the king's justice is always so just that everybody sees that it's just and goes along with it. If the king's justice is indeed just, then the prisoners will agree to whatever penalty is given to them and are made better by it. They don't have to be forced to do anything. They do it voluntarily. It's ridiculously idealistic, right? People don't just repent of bad things. They insist that they're innocent, and they have to be forced. And this is the source of Quixote's initial confusion. But at the end of the sequence, after he's gone through all the interrogations, he approaches the guards and he asks them to release the prisoners. It's on 457. I propose to ask these gentlemen, your guards, and the commissary, to be so good as to unshackle you and permit you to go in peace. There will be no dearth of others to serve his majesty under more propitious circumstances. In other words, there's no shortage of galley slaves. The kingdom is not going to ground to a halt just because these prisoners are let free. And it does not appear to me to be just to make slaves of those whom God created as free men. There's something pretty compelling in this, right? I mean, God makes people free. So putting them in a prison or making them work as slaves doesn't seem like that's not our call. Maybe we're overreaching our authority. What is more, gentlemen of the guard, these poor fellows have committed no offense against you. This has back to do with the issue of the king. Why is the king not here? In Quixote's mind, crimes are all personal. If you insult somebody, then that person gets justice against you. Think back to Beowulf, right? When, two families are feuding, then it's up to those two families to deal with things. The king doesn't get involved. He may say, well, you're innocent and you're guilty, but it's up to you to get your reward or your punishment. So to him, these guards, you haven't been wronged. If the king has been wronged, then let the king do the punishment. But this middle faceless bureaucracy, this administration, which punishes people, when, it's not the individual, that you're not the person that's been hurt. So if you haven't been hurt by these men, then you have no reason to hold them. Up there, he goes on, up there, you have to imagine him pointing up there, each of us will have to answer for his own sins. For God in heaven will not fail to punish the evil and reward the good. Why are we even in the business of punishment? If we really believe that everybody will be punished after death for their sins, Why don't we leave it to God? Why are we in the punishment business at all? It's not our job. It's not our business. There's a perfect judge who's going to handle all of this. A judge that cannot misjudge. So let's let the right guy do the job. For God in heaven will not fail to punish the evil and reward the good. And it is not good for self-respecting men to be executioners of their fellow men in something that does not concern them. If these guys didn't hurt you, then you have no business bringing them to their execution. And he thanks the guards. He says, I thank you very much for letting them all go, and if you don't let them go, well, I will beat you up. Of course, it doesn't work out that way. It never does. But that whole conversation is designed to make us question some of the truths of our justice system and our civic reality and the bureaucracy and the impersonal nature of all of it. The way that we punish people and the duration and fierceness of that punishment. One of these prisoners, for example, was tortured. It's all designed to make us question the way that our legal system and our punishment system works. Book 1 ends soon after. We won't get into Book 2 except to talk very briefly about how it ends, because of course Quixote dies. He has to die. He's an old man. His death is inevitable. It's the only way the book can end. And of course it does. But it ends with Quixote returning to sanity. He recovers, and I put that in quote marks. Imagine little air quotes around that word recovers, because when we see him return to sanity and disavow all of his previous activities, he says, oh no, I'm not Don Quixote, I'm just this guy. And I haven't done any of those things, and I'm not a knight, and I'm not a champion of the good and the oppressed. I'm just this old guy. It's sad. We don't want Quixote to betray his ideals. Think of the ending that we want for Quixote. We want him to go down fighting. We want him to go down fighting a windmill, thinking it's a giant. I mean, that's the way that Quixote's life should end, to give us some sense of satisfaction. But of course, Cervantes is writing a tragedy and he's being ironic. And so Quixote has to end dying in his bed, having given up all of his imaginary dreams, all of his fantasies. He gives up. He doesn't just give them up. He has all of his books burned, and he says, I'm going to give all of my wealth to my niece, but if she ever marries a guy who can read books, then she loses everything. And it's awful. And it's the worst possible ending in the sense of personal satisfaction. It's not what we want to happen to him. And it's because we recognize that as a tragedy. It's because we look at that and we say, oh, that's a terrible ending. That helps us to understand how much we have come to idealize and identify and ennoble Quixote as the man who has rejected your world in favor of his own. All right. We'll leave it there. We had a long lecture tonight, but I hope that you found it useful. We've got a couple more to go, and then we'll be wrapped up. So good luck, and have fun with Cervantes.